and this is Mae Brussell, broadcast number 635. It's February the 6th, 1984. A year ago this evening, and a year goes fast, we were talking about Alexander Haig, who was just knighted. He was made a Knight of Malta by the Vatican, and a friend who's now World Watcher, who was, sent a list of the new Knights of Malta. I have to share that with you. I haven't put that on the air yet. I appreciate that. He went to St. Patrick's and got a list of the new Knights of Malta. And I was talking about the various agents in our United States government that work with Alexander Haig and with the Vatican, linking them to particular violences, political assassinations, and scandals of the past year. Also, a year ago tonight, there was a tug of war between Chase Manhattan and London. The High Court in London was telling Chase Manhattan to ignore subpoenas for information on Mark Rich. He's the fellow that owns 50% of 20th Century Fox and Pebble Beach up here. The international oil dealing firm that made a tremendous profit and went off with about $100 million to Swiss banks. It's a year later, and Mark Rich is living in Spain. He does not account for the money that he took out of this country. That happened in Italy with the scandal was going on just a year ago, the gas scandal of $86 million, a commission that went down from Saudi Arabia, Delisio Jelly, to Nazis down in Argentina, and it was that act that caused the law last week that I mentioned that the priests will not be immune from arrest in Italy. They're shifting the Vatican out of the Italian government. The Vatican had a big part and does have of draining cash from the Italian people and from the church itself to the Nazi parties. Last year I had an article and was mentioned John DeLorean, who had been arrested. Will John DeLorean deliver Hollywood? He threatened an inquisition. John DeLorean delivered, he's very good delivering people, and he certainly delivered Larry Flint for the intelligence and got Larry Flint involved. Gordon Novell from the Defense Department and the CIA was traveling between Jack Anderson and John DeLorean in New Jersey and gave these tapes to Larry Flint. Of course, you can't give them to people who don't want them. He got himself suckered into this for his moment of notoriety or whatever. He got his finger into the DeLorean story, and touching DeLorean is like Tar Baby. The rabbit that touches the Tar Baby, it gets stuck in the tar. Nobody touches DeLorean and comes out really clean. Gordon Novell was the one who supplied these tapes. That was in The Rebel, a picture of Novell with Larry Flint. Now it's a year later, and Larry was in court last week in Los Angeles. I'll do more on that in a few minutes, or in the second half of this program this evening. And he was crying in court, and he said that the fellow in charge of security at his home, and Gordon Novell and two other people raped his 14-year-old daughter. You can't go back, he said, what about Novell? I said, stay away from him. That's when Larry was sane and wasn't going down this terrible situation that came down to him. He didn't, DeLorean did deliver Larry Flint, and he and his co-partner did this to 5 or 6 other people, totally bankrupt them and ruin their lives, and maybe other people we don't know about. He hasn't yet delivered Hollywood, but he certainly delivered Flint. Also last year I was talking about Klaus Barbie and his links to Henry Kissinger, and why from Oberammergau Kissinger is so important, how he ties into Klaus Barbie in Bolivia and with the cocaine traffic and with the World Nazi Organization afterwards. That was just a year ago tonight, a year ago last night. Now, I got an article, the same person who attended the Knighting of Malta this week. It's from the New Republic, February the 6th, 1984. There's a list of people from the W.R. Grace and Company who are Knights of Malta. But the article I got was from the New Republic, from Republic magazine, February the 6th, 1984. This is the New Republic. You can get it at the library. And it's titled Watergate on the Rhine, Der Scandal. And there are two elements there, one with the head of NATO who was removed, Mr. Kiesling. But the interesting part was that they touched on the Flick affair, and I've mentioned it a few times, but not enough. The Frederick Flick organization that works along with J. Peter Grace, and Mr. Flick is on the board of J. Peter Grace, and Dr. Frederick Carl Flick and his father were people that were behind the funding of Adolf Hitler and the utilizing of the wages from slave labor and concentration camps, and were very much a part of the propaganda machine of Adolf Hitler. And the Republic article, the New Republic, has a story about the Flick affair and the $300 million of tax exemption that was given to the Flicks, and then they in turn poured it into W.R. Grace and Company in the United States. But one of the interesting things out of this article was it said the list of names involved with the Flick Company that's coming out in Germany is a who's who of German politics. And it said it's a short step from Chairman Flick to Eberhard von Brauchitsch, Brauchitsch, chairman of Flick, and they found out in the files that he's the nephew of Hitler's commander-in-chief. So that the Flicks and J. Peter Grace and the Knights of Malta, goodness knows what else is in their hidden files, but they're getting closer to be Hitler's commander-in-chief, to be the nephew, and to be working with these people. And it was Mr. Grace that was put on the commission to look into ways to save money in this country for Ronald Reagan. Fancy title for his commission, but the point is that we're now getting to the people that actually ran Nazi Germany, right down to Otto Ambros, the chemist with the gas, or John Paul II, who worked at Auschwitz for I.G. Farben. The Flick story over in Germany is bringing out higher Nazis than are believable, and on the board of the Grace Company, I was mailed a list of some of the people, one Dr. Frederick Carl Flick. And of course, I've mentioned before that Roger Millikan, who is on the board of the W.R. Grace Company, was the man who put John Reese onto Western Goals with Larry McDonald that incorporated the Nazi connections, the Galen connections from Germany, right to the Los Angeles Police Department. And I have a lot more news for you on the LAPD. I did some last week, and they're taking material home, J. Paul, and working in his garage in Long Beach and in the offices, allegedly for security of the Olympic Games, but secret from the major body of the investigative police in Los Angeles, the anti-terrorist group. Now, before I go on to part 2 of the article about the Klarsfields and the Nazi connections and what that article meant in opening up some more avenues, I want to say that just today, the Congress is having a hearing on the media access to being present when we invade a country or go to war. The Pentagon was put on the carpet for excluding all news media, literally for 5 days in Grenada, and that is the number one story of Grenada. There's a 5-part story that I'm working on and broke it down into that many sections, but far and above everything else is the news media. And what this country needs, they should go one step further and maybe present a package to a congressman whenever there's a political assassination or the death of any person who's interested in politics, even if it's Lenny Bruce or Marilyn Monroe with a politician, people related to those people in office. Every time there's a political assassination of a president, a congressman, a writer, somebody that is into politics in some way in the mainstream at the time they're killed, there should be a pool of people, and I might have mentioned this before, whose names are fixed like a lottery, and you, out of that pool, you bring in coroners and investigators from 50 states. You don't know who in advance, and you draw it publicly, and you get a team from 50 states to come to that city to see the body, to see the autopsy reports, doctors, coroners, lawyers, investigators, and the press, to go into a home. If a man is arrested like Artie Bremer for shooting Wallace, E. Howard Hunt shouldn't be in that home before anybody gets there, get a phone call to go over there. When Maurice Bishop was killed in Grenada, Michael Ledeen shouldn't be the person that's sent down there with Mr. Brown, a soldier of fortune, to rake out the papers of Maurice Bishop, because they can plant evidence to prove his intentions of working with the Soviet Union that justifies the invasion. You have to have the media at the home when the door is opened. There should be people from around the country flown in who look at all the evidence, and then you wouldn't have those phony diaries, those planted diaries of Lee Oswald and Artie Bremer and Sirhan, and everybody would have a chance to fingerprint the diaries, to fingerprint these alleged suicide notes, and so forth. The press has to be at every battle scene, or else the battle is described only from the point of view of the people who went in. And that is not good enough at a time where we could have a military coup at any moment, and the excuse for taking over would be identical to Hitler's Reichstag. With that history, and with the same Nazis running the defense, intelligence, and the CIA, Hitler should not have been allowed to round up labor leaders, students, and so forth based upon a bomb falling into the building there as the excuse. Before any action is made by any executive, a lottery should be ready and pull in people to see who did it, see who the Carloses are that worked for the CIA and Samuel Cummings, see who the people are who caused that violence. If we don't have those laws in advance, you're going to wake up with a Reichstag operation because these people are swift and they've been trained, and that commando landing in Grenada was exactly the kind of thing that they're doing with not the regular U.S. Army, but with the Rangers and the Special Forces. And the Special Forces also were set up by Adolf Hitler and Nazis that John McCloy released out of prison. Now, this is the year of the rat. An article in the paper today, former South Vietnamese President Key was the center of attraction in L.A. It's the year of the rat. Key also was a admirer of Adolf Hitler, had posters about him. I had a poster about Key during the war with quotations on his admiration of Adolf Hitler. He was celebrating the year of the rat. There was one article today on Henry Kissinger that his name was discovered on a list of terrorist targets. This is out of the Washington Post, February the 6th. That is disinformation, just as the story that Ajah worked for the Bulgarian KGB is disinformation. They're claiming, Scotland Yard, that when the Israeli ambassador to London, Mr. Argov, was killed June 3rd, 1982, that they had papers that are just coming to trial in February 84, 2 years later, that Kissinger was on a list. That is identical to Alexander Haig saying that his car was bombed on the military base when he was announcing he was running for president. Kissinger wants to be president of the United States. He wants to show that he's a victim of the terrorists, that he's being chased. There's no way, the way he's traveled and moved around with these people in and out of the Middle East, Israel, all over the world where this Mr. Nidal is, Abu Nidal, there's no way that they knew for 2 years that his name was on the list. They keep his name in the news no matter what, and he will always be there. He's on a new commercial, I Love New York, Henry Kissinger. He's on the soap operas with Gerald Ford. He's visible everywhere, whether the terrorists are after him or whether you're supposed to see shows on Broadway and big posters. You're going to see that ugly face until it's the president or the Fuhrer of the United States. I don't believe that story, and I don't believe they had that information 2 years, and I'm sick and tired of Henry Kissinger. Now, Beate Klarsfeld was down in Chile. She was arrested. It was kind of cheap, $8 fine, and she's out, but that's pretty good. She was with her rider, Peter Hellman, and she was protesting the fact that Chile keeps Nazi SS Colonel Walter Rauff down there in Chile. She's a spunky woman. And I want to continue part 2 about Ms. Klarsfeld, and if I have time, bring it right up to what's happening now at Rebel, because there's an interesting connection here through all of these characters, and I want to get to that. I don't know if I'll have time, and I don't want to go too fast so that you miss the point, so we'll do as much as we can this week and then go on to it next week. I mentioned her role in slapping Mr. Karl Kissinger and accusing him of being a Nazi, which he was. At the German Congress, she was so furious that this top Nazi in charge of propaganda was back as Chancellor of Germany. She studied the children I mentioned before at this home, the orphans that were taken, and she investigated how they were murdered and sent to the concentration camp The article was called "The Woman Who Avenged the Children of Izu," I-Z-I-E-U. And she studied them. She studied how 312 top Nazi war criminals were out doing business, dealing drugs, selling weapons, and terror. And she traced Klaus Barbie. She had some pictures printed in France and Germany in newspapers in 1968 of Klaus Barbie, and she hoped that somebody would recognize him. He had changed his name, and she hoped that he would be recognized. There was a man in South America, Klaus Altmann, A-L-T-M-A-N-N. A Lima, Peru businessman was in Munich, and he saw the picture. His name is Herbert John. And he saw the picture of Altmann, and he recognized him from Lima, Peru, and knew that there was a German who looked just exactly like him at the home of a man named Fritz Schwend, S-C-H-W-E-N-D. So he had gotten a passport by the Red Cross. He was assisted by the Germans. They gave him she went to the German offices and found out that the same man that she wanted, Klaus Altmann, had the same birthday as Klaus Barbie, the same first names. And so she flew down to Lima, Peru, and by the time she got there, Barbie had disappeared. And she took a woman with her, Ida Hallenbrenner. I might have mentioned her before. I-T-A was her first name, H-A-L-A-U-B-R-E-N-N-E-R. And her husband and family had been killed, her eldest son by the Nazis, and two children, daughters, put in this particular orphanage, had been killed by the Nazis. And she took this woman, nearly 70 years old, down there to Bolivia to get Klaus Barbie and to find him. And the two women were chained with padlocks to the fence of Barbie's office. Now, this fellow mentioned that Barbie left, that he left Bolivia, and was in Peru with a man named Fritz Schwend, his host. And in the article that was in Parade magazine, January 22nd, that's a magazine section that comes out in various newspapers, and it's in the Washington Post, if you want to look up in the library. She just casually mentioned that Mr. Fritz Schwend was employed by the Central Intelligence Agency, as was Walter Rauff, as was Klaus Barbie. And Schwend had important, and she described it as very important contacts, this fellow told her, in the United States. He had very high-level contacts in the United States. Now, David Emery up in Palo Alto, who does fantastic research, and read the article, immediately called me. We read Aftermath often, and there are things to reread all the time in Aftermath, written by Ladislas Farago. And in Aftermath, Farago describes how the money from the Jews was taken when they were taken to concentration camps, this tremendous wealth. They held on to their money, stones, precious stones worth millions, diamonds, diamond rings, valuables, and then at the end of the war, people were looking for the SS treasure and all this money that was hidden for the Nazis to use after the war. And in the process of looking for the money, they came to a man named Mr. Rajakowitz, R-A-J-A-K-O-W-I-T-S-C-H. And Rajakowitz was very close to Bishop Udall, H-U-D-A-L, who helped the Nazis with the Rat Line. That was the train that helped them leave from American custody down to the Vatican, and they supplied them with papers and lots of money to go to South America and start their business. And they wanted to know where Bishop Udall was getting the money. They had their shipping costs and so forth, and in the process of tracing Udall's money and the Underground Railroad, these people were housed and fed, and then given travel documents and sent down with money from mysterious origin that the bishop couldn't account for. And they came to an office in Switzerland that was run, a financier, Freddie Mercer, M-E-R-S-E-R, who was a partner of Frederick Schwend, S-C-H-W-N-D. And Schwend, as I briefly mentioned last week, was in charge of Operation Bernhardt, which involved counterfeiting literally over $100 million, getting ready to fund Nazis when the war was over. And Bishop Udall, who ran the Rat Line, who helped Walter Rauff leave the country, and Klaus Barbie and hundreds of other people, was picking up the money in Switzerland, in a Swiss office connected with Frederick Schwend, S-C-H-W-E-N-D. Now, in the Great Heroin Coup, and David Emery also had his fingers right on this right away. That is the story of the people behind who killed John Kennedy, the drug running, the narcotic traffic, the Nazi network in South and Central America. In the Great Heroin Coup on page 144, it tells about the Watergators. E. Howard Hunt was working with a most intriguing conspirator named Bender, a German refugee whose true identity remains a matter of speculation. Some contend that he has been an agent of the West German Gehlen espionage network. This is E. Howard Hunt of Watergate, working with Bernard Barker and Frank Sturgis, worked in the CIA with a man from the Gehlen espionage group whose name was Bender. Then it goes on to say the former security chief of the Dominican Republic, for Trujillo, claims that Bender was Fritz Schwend, a Gehlen collaborator and leader of the Nazis in Peru, so that this Nazi could have Swiss bank accounts, have the Operation Bernhard with the money for the Nazis to leave, with the help of the CIA from Germany, and this is where Henry Kissinger was with them when it was the OSS, put them on the boats to South America, and then meet them and work overthrowing one by one the death squads and the military dictatorships that were put into power in South and Central America. Now, the Great Heroin Coup refers to Fritz Schwend, the Gehlen agent. Prior to the Bay of Pigs, Schwend was allegedly the CIA's man in the Dominican Republic. He used the name Don Federico. He worked with mobster Frank Costello and ex-Cuban dictator Batista, and also involved in their operations was Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers, and I mentioned that because Chennault is on the board of 20th Century Fox with Mark Rich and Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford and the people who were part of the conspiracy or part of the cover-up. Now, in this book, The Great Heroin Coup, it says that one of Santo Traficando's personal CIA contacts for the Bay of Pigs was Frank Farino, that's Frank Sturgis, Castro's liquidator of mob casinos, and he identifies him also as Frank Sturgis, that's one of the Watergate defendants, who ran the Miami-based International Anti-Communist Brigade. Another detail from Sturgis's past, now we go over to Frank Sturgis again in Watergate, is especially interesting in light of Frank Bender, alleged ties to the Gehlen organization. Frank Sturgis lived in Berlin as a courier between the nation's intelligence agencies and would be in contact with the Gehlen network. And they have Frank Sturgis, and also is Bernard Barker working with Bender, who is Schwend from Peru, who was up in Switzerland with the money to give the Nazis to leave by way of the Vatican down to South America. Another reference in the Great Heroin Coup talks about the double-check organization that worked with these people. In my article in The Rebel, I have a lot on the Nazis and the JFK Kennedy assassination and how after 1952, they all started to get together. This is the team I was talking about, and incidentally, there's a reference here of these people working together down with the Bay of Pigs and Dominican Republic, the operation and the coup there. And the man in charge of the CIA then was Ray S. Cline, in charge of Georgetown's propaganda mill with Michael Ladine. Michael Ladine is the propagandist of the Bulgarian plot to try to kill the Pope. Again, he was at Maurice Bishop's offices just 2 months ago in October down in Grenada. The CIA, Ray Cline, Ladine, and Fritz Schwend, the money man for these operations coming out of Peru. Now, J. Peter Grace, who I began the program talking about, ran Peru, ran it for the Nazis, ran it for the CIA. In fact, I mentioned in the Rebel article on the JFK assassination that Oswald's money man, the guy who got him the job at the book depository by way of Ruth Payne, or at the printers with the security clearances, George de Mohrenschildt, who was his Defense Department CIA control agent, went down to Peru and worked with the Grace family and also with Klaus Barbie down in South America and traveled the same route. And now we take it one step further from John Kennedy up to Watergate. Now, taking this information about the Klarsfelds and Mr. Schwen being the operator with the Bay of Pigs people, I go back now 2 years earlier, before Farago's book came out. In 1972, I wrote Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And that article was about the Watergate people, the men arrested at the Watergate Hotel, and their links to the Reinhard Gehlen operation and the network of the Nazis around the world. And then the third section of that article is how Nixon really came to power, bringing these Nazis together. Now, here we have Richard Nixon at Watergate working with Hunt and Liddy, paid by the White House, and with Mr. Schwen, working with them, top Nazi. And there were other top Nazis besides Nikolai Malaksa that I wrote about, going through Nixon's office down to Argentina and involved with various parts of the assassination puzzle. In my Martha Mitchell article in 1972, I was describing Bernard Barker, and keep in mind that the burglary happened June the 17th, and within 3 weeks, I had this article prepared for Paul Krasner, and we had it published by August. I described Bernard Barker, alias Frank Carter. Barker worked closely together with Hunt, with E. Howard Hunt, planning the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was the conduit of funds for the Central Intelligence Agency, the payment for the recruits of the Bay of Pigs. He worked with Frank Bender of the CIA. I knew that was important, although Bender has never been identified in any Watergate books. There's about 100 of them. I own most of them, I think. Bender is not identified. Now, if Bender is Fritz Schwen, and he paid for the money for hundreds of Nazis to go out of the CIA and American custody down to South America and to Egypt, into Israel, into Palestine, into the all over the Mediterranean and South America. I knew that Frank Bender was important, but I didn't know that until the Great Heroin Coup came out that he was the same man working with the CIA who now has been identified by the Klarsfelds as protecting Klaus Barbie when she wanted him extradited and protecting him in Peru, because that is the base of the W.R. Grace and Company down there in Peru. Now, I can do a lot of references in the book Aftermath. They refer to Mr. Schwen, Frederick Schwen, in about 20 different places, and I don't have to go into those in detail. You can get that book, most of you, or pick it up at the library or used bookstore. On broadcast number 437, this was in 1980, 4 years ago, I talked about Frederick Schwen. He passed away. He lived in Lima, Peru. He was former Nazi Major Frederick Schwen, who printed counterfeit money and dollars to ruin the economy of Britain and the United States. And then I referred to one reference in Aftermath that he was in drug pushing. He was the key man of Operation Bernhardt, counterfeit money with notes from the Bank of England and so forth. And he was involved with complex schemes, only $100 million in counterfeit notes. And the network, as I say, of Skorzeny with Evita Peron and Klaus Barbie, I detailed quite a bit in the Rebel magazine, November 1983, that goes into those Nazi connections. Now, one thing that has to do with Larry Flynt and the Schwen connections, and then I'll go more to Larry Flynt on the second half of this program. I was talking to some people at Rebel because I'm very anxious to have that that stuff that he had supposed to be vitamins or health food, this great chemical mix. It's made up at Klamath Falls, that blue-green manna. I wanted a laboratory to check that out. I don't have the money to find out if Larry Flynt had been poisoned and the people in the family, there were chemicals in there that could alter their behavior or their mind. And I was told by somebody down there that a fellow in the office by the name of Bruce Oliver was looking into this and had found out that, in fact, this stuff was damaging. Now, I'm not saying it is. I don't want to be sued by the guy up at KC Laboratories. I'm just interested in whether or not it is. I'm not saying it is. So I was talking on the phone to this guy, and his name is Bruce Oliver. And we were talking, and he's going back to Washington. He lived in Larry Flint's house for a month, and then he evidently was kicked out of the house, and he hangs around the rebel office. I don't know in what capacity. It's none of my business. But he was talking to me on the phone, and we were saying what a tough time Larry had. He had just gotten 15-month sentence, and he obviously was out of his head and shouldn't have gotten anything until his head was clear, and he could act in court appropriate to what was happening. He's still disturbed coming out of that Springfield, Missouri federal pen. You can imagine what was going on there. So Oliver gave me his phone number in Washington, D.C. That's his home base. It was a toll-free number, 800 number. And I said, well, you must be pretty important to have a toll-free number. So he volunteered that his father is Robert Oliver. And I said, you're kidding. Robert Oliver, here in the rebel office, I'm talking to Bruce Oliver. We'll take a 1-minute break now, and then in case you don't know the story of the Olivers, and if you want to run for 1 minute and look up your Watergate books index, otherwise I'll tell you about that in 1 minute. We'll take a 1-minute break and get back to the Olivers. We'll go back to the second half of this broadcast. This is broadcast number 635, February the 6th, 1984. I do call them tapes because, as you know, this is live on the air. I do it right from the station here, and then it is tape recorded at the same time, and then they go out by subscription. And I might remind you, those of you who want bibliographies of this material, I get envelopes from people that are dated, and they write inside the date, and I send them the sheets, self-addressed, stamped envelope, and say which broadcast, or every 4 weeks, say the month of February, the month of January, and I'll send you the references. It isn't a printed script. It's the references of the books I use, such as The Great Heroin Coup, or the article I wrote, or The Aftermath. You can look up the dates or the article about the Klarsfields and look it up for yourself. It's a source of references if you want them. That's helpful. Incidentally, a woman who lives in Pasadena subscribed. Elderly woman who took the tapes a while back, and she asked me if I knew anybody who wanted those tapes. And I said, yes, I don't have an extra copy to loan out. And she sent me back about 20 or 30 broadcasts. I didn't bring in the titles, but they're from 1977, 78, and some of them they're very pertinent. I was looking to see which, I think they all are anyway. But there's some really great stuff. Now, if anybody wants to borrow those cassettes or borrow 10, so it's not so bulky, and then I'll return them. You can tape them off, listen to them, dub them off, and return them, and then I'll send 10 more. All you have to do is pay for the postage, and I'll send them to you, and I can start loaning out some of those tapes. If you want some of those back tapes and can't afford to buy them and you want to listen to them, I can start loaning these out to you, and you can use her tapes, and that would be very nice because there's a lot of back broadcasts that people ask me about, and they just can't afford the current and the back, or they take it live off the air and want some of the back broadcasts. So whoever writes or calls first, I'll send them out, and then just return them, listen and return them, and then I'll keep a list, and we'll keep them rotating. Now, back to Mr. Oliver. I was talking to Bruce Oliver, in the office of the Rebel. His brother, Robert Oliver, was the person in the Democratic headquarters. Rather, Spencer Oliver was the brother. His father is Robert. Our Spencer Oliver Jr. was the one whose telephone was tapped when Hunt and Liddy and James McCord were in the Democratic offices the night of the Watergate arrest. Now, I told him that I had written this article on Martha Mitchell and the Watergate, and I thought that they were setting the taps up on the phone and in the files so that after Hunt and Liddy and Frank Sturgis and Bernard Barker and McCord planned the riots down in Miami, just as there were riots in Chicago in 1968, then they could say, well, we had word that they were going to, so we were tapping the Democrats because there were radicals there, and we heard Castro was giving money to the Democrats. And they could blame the Democrats for any violence or murders or the murder of Nixon and blame it because they picked it up in the Democratic offices. That's what the taps were about. He said that's pretty novel. He hadn't thought about it, but that's what I was writing about at the time. Well, this Bruce Oliver's brother was the one whose telephone was tapped. But the interesting thing is that R. Spencer Oliver, his father, is a well-known public relations man in Washington, D.C., who brought the Howard Hughes account to Mullen Associates. Mullen Associates was a dummy front for the CIA. G. Gordon Liddy set up about 90 organizations for Richard Nixon. The Howard Hughes organization, if you read my article in The Rebel, is about the Nazification of America and the use of Karl Boyer and Hitler's top agents with setting up an umbrella. The Howard Hughes in 1972 didn't exist in any shape or form, and his father brought in Hunt and Liddy and Sturgis and Barker and all those people, according to William Colby, the CIA director, wrote to Senator Howard Baker. They were representing the CIA in the Mullen office. So I have written about Mr. Schwen, Fritz Schwen, Frederick Schwen, and Bernard Barker. They link to the Bay of Pigs. They link to the coup in the United States, Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorina with Lee Harvey Oswald, with the World Anti-Communist League, with Double Check down in Miami, down at the offices on Canal Street with Guy Bannister and Lee Harvey Oswald. This is, again, not only with the Nazi connections that I was writing about in The Rebel at JFK, working at the Watergate with Richard Nixon, up Watergate, because my article stopped with the JFK assassination, but the fellow whose father brought those people into the Mullen offices with all the hanky-panky and dummy fronts that they were going to do, is in Los Angeles for some capacity at the Rebel office. Now, I wrote down a formula. I told Oliver what it is, Bruce Oliver. I don't know him from Adam, but I don't shirk from being honest because everything I say is on the air. And I said to him, he's either there in good faith or he's there as a spy. It can't be both ways. You can be a good spy, but it can't be a good faith. So I said, okay, I'll give you a formula to find out what happened to Larry Flynt, because they were all upset about what happened in court that day. And I'll tell you about what happened down in Los Angeles. I said, I'm going to give you a formula. Get a pencil. I told him, this is before I knew who his daddy and his brother were. Okay, but it didn't matter. I repeated it afterwards and sent the material for William Colby down to Rebel to show that I had the Colby report on this and that I'm not hiding anything. They can have it. They can print it. It's a very valuable document. I give it to Larry Flynt. To get in the Rebel, it's theirs to go for. Okay? This is the formula to find out what happened to Larry Flynt. And it's very important. You may say, well, how does he compare to some big decisions now, like Edwin Meese in the Justice Department, or the appointments, or the international affairs of what's going on? He is an example. He is a microcosm of all of us. And what happens to him happens to all of us eventually. And we all stick together through this thing, through thick or thin. Now, this is the way Larry Flynt needs to get help. And he gets these broadcasts, so he'll have this tape by 2 days from now. How to chart the problems of Larry Flynt. 1, you list the months of the year from September the 1st, 1983, because everything was going well until then. He's financially secure, the family was high, he was going to produce a movie, his wife, he was going to run for president, he was getting out a new publication, everything was great. Money was flowing, the wine was flowing, it was great, okay? You take in columns, September, October, November, December, January, February. You make those 5 columns. Then you list under each column your cash assets that month. And in that column, whether it's October or November the 1st, you write on a chart going down when your cash began to diminish. Then in each column, you write the person who received the largest hunk of money in a given time period, who was being paid. There's a picture of him handing $100,000 to Dick Gregory. That's an example that he has in the magazine. Okay? Now you list the persons, political, controversial, month by month, and I have a list of 12 of them. 12 people that I know of, and goodness knows who I don't know of, that entered into his home, lived at his home or in his office. And I gave examples: G. Gordon Liddy, Mitchell Wardbell, Gordon Novell, Timothy Leary, and about 7 others. You list them names, and then under the column, you put what month they entered into his home or his life. If he hadn't seen him in 5 years, when did they resurface now? Was it in September 15th? Was it September 30th? Then you list what each of these people did for Larry Flint. Did they just have dinner? Did he just invite them for dinner? What did they do for him? What information did they give him? How were they of value to him? He's publishing these magazines. He's coming out with the Rebel. What did these people give to him that is unusual or rare that he can use, and the circumstances by which they came? Then you list the date that they left or faded away or even died, like Mitchell Werbell. Then on this chart you list the day and the reason for the meeting with Greg Bautzer. He told me one day, early in this scene, he was having lunch with the attorney Greg Bautzer. I said, literally, just to paraphrase it, don't do it. Just don't do it. And he did. So on this chart, you put the day he had lunch with Greg Bautzer. Then, underneath that, how much money each one of these people he gave something to, like he put Werbell on the payroll and Novell on the payroll. Timothy Leary wrote some articles. There's an article by him in the New Hustler. What he paid each one of these people, how much he paid them. And then the last thing is to get a chemical analysis of the blue-green manna, which Bruce Oliver said he was going to do. It cost about $1,500. He said he didn't have the money. And then I heard other stories that the money is available. I'm sure $1,500 is available. And he suggested there was trouble with it, that it's dangerous to your liver and your kidneys and your brain. Get a keen analysis of what it has. And then you compare all of the symptoms that Larry Flynn has to a list that I have from the Central Intelligence Agency that I typed up once, that through their various documents that they printed, they had a list of things that they wanted to perfect and make possible. It was a $25 million study by the CIA, put together by Allen Dulles, who brought the Nazis over here, and Richard Helms of the CIA. And you make a list of the symptoms that Larry has, and you can look at your society and look at some of the others. One of the 25 million project was to find substances to promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public. That was one of their projects. The other was show ways to bend the mind where people become self-doubting, bewildered, and substitute chemicals for them in place of codeine or painkillers. And Larry gets painkillers for the situation when he was shot in 1978. They spent $25 million part of the project to cause schizophrenia, that would be diagnosed schizophrenia, through chemicals so that it would not be diagnosed by a physician in advance. Now keep in mind that he is sent for a psychiatric analysis to a federal penitentiary mental place when he's publishing articles about the President of the United States, about Larry McDonald, about Western goals, about the security for the Olympics, about Edwin Meese, and he is breaking the back of Paul Axel and the crime syndicate to the President of the United States. He's in their custody, and they've spent $25 million. Now, many of you might have seen the article in the paper this week about Marilyn Monroe. There's bickering over a letter that she wrote. Marilyn Monroe was put in a mental hospital by the psychiatrist in 1961, and she begged the Strasbergs to get out of the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic. She wrote, "Please help me, Lee. This is the last place I should be." And the Strasbergs, who want the letter back because it's now worth $18,000, didn't give a penny to answer Marilyn Monroe's plea. And then Marilyn Monroe is dead a year later after being at the psychiatrist that same afternoon. And it's very important to know the role. Again, it was David Emery up north who obtained for me and copied a book that I'm going to be doing a lot more on the program about. It's about the psychiatric profession called The Men Behind Adolf Hitler. And it's about the psychiatrists who perfected the techniques that later became part of the United States Mental Institute, mental hospitals, And the men behind Hitler is P.O. Box, well, I'll give you the address or you can write to me, P.O. Box 5792, San Francisco. It's 94109 is the area, the zip code, 469 in California tax. This is on the psychiatric profession, the kind of people that put Larry Flynt in these hospitals and have these medications for them, and the kind of people who put Martha Mitchell into the hospitals also, and the Marilyn Monroes, and use that psychiatric profession for their purposes when they want to capture somebody and literally just wipe them out and make them discredited. Now, the thing about Larry Flynt, he went to court this last week, a long article in the Los Angeles Times, Flynt sentenced to 15 months in prison. He did not have a fair chance because the man was not well. The judge had him there for 5 hours, rambling, raving. They gagged him. They took him out. He cried. He cried about his security guards raping his 14-year-old daughter and mentioned Novell as one of the people who did it. He didn't belong in the court. He was shouting obscenities. He was crying. Give me more. The judge let him cry. They should have sent him back somewhere for observation until his head was clear. He did not deserve that sentencing. It all started when Mitchell Werbel took him to court wearing an American flag, and Werbel carrying what was supposed to be a weapon, and of course that guy conveniently died. And Larry still likes him, but he'll catch on. Larry liked Novell. It was Mitchell Werbel who was in court with him. He liked Novell, but he's on to Novell. What a painful way to learn. Now, in the meanwhile, Jack Anderson had an article this week, and I'll run down for you the psychiatric jobs that the CIA spent $25 million on, but I want to tell you that Jack Anderson has a story this week about kid porn, that the government is going to spend $800,000 and show them Hustler magazine. Dig this, Hustler magazine and Penthouse and Playboy, and see if this you can recognize juvenile behavior by reading these magazines that they consider obscene. Handing these to children and letting them look at that to see if violence in the future, not television violence, not commercials, not 18,000 murders before they ever hardly go to school, little children day and night, and after they come home from school seeing the murders. The government is going to spend $800,000 to find out, and Hustler is mentioned, is causing the violence in this country. They haven't come up with anything better outside of the ITT Twinkies that Dan Whitey. So they're gunning after Hustler, and I heard a discussion on homosexuals on CNN, and a question, they mentioned Hustler and Larry Flynt again as the problem behind the homosexuals, and the homosexuals bring AIDS and we'll all die of AIDS. So there is a media propaganda. Now, the Washington Post has an article, January 25th, People's Drug Store in Virginia is removed the February issue of Hustler. The People's Drug Store in North Virginia sells 20,000 Hustlers every month, but they took it out of there because some people, not named, didn't want it there. Now, the February Hustler was not different than any other Hustler that came out in the past 2 years, except for one thing. It had to do with Western goals in Virginia. It'd be interesting to know how close this is to Western goals, linking them to Nazi Germany, to the Gehlen operation, to the BND, the Vienna offices, linking them to Mr. John Reese and Milliken and J. Peter Grace. What they did is indicative of the way they would like to squeeze off Larry Flynt's publication. But that was because it was political. That had nothing to do with the flag. That had nothing to do with... When that February Hustler came out, that was about Larry McDonald's office in Alexandria, Virginia, that mentioned Fritz Kramer and Sven Kramer and the top people of the National Security Council that worked with Admiral Moore, formerly the Joint Chief of Staff, and Edward Teller and Milliken of Grace Company. What he published in that article on Larry McDonald was what was kept off the stand, and the proof that they're after him for political reasons is, one of the proofs is that they will not sell that in Virginia. And if they start a movement like that and don't allow these political articles to happen anywhere and can move in these people into their homes to break their backs and take over their lives, it certainly deserves more attention what is happening to Larry Flint. I sensed this all along, what was coming down, and of course, it's coming fast. Now, apropos of that, I think many of you do not remember 1971 when a lot of the revelation of the CIA mind control experimentations came down in government hearings. Senator Church, and of course now he's dying of cancer, the fellow that began the investigations. But I took out of my government documents, and I got some from the Pentagon and from the CIA, and from the books that were published, I started listing their stated purposes of the programs. There was the Operation Artichoke, the MK Ultra, what the stated purposes were for the $25 million of our tax money that was spent. So reading just some of their own purposes, nothing I made up. These are from their documents. And it's a long time. 1977 is a long way away, or it seems to be, from here. So let me review for you some of the purposes that they spent and see if you think Larry Flint got any of that kind of medication, and also some of the other people we know. The stated purposes of their program, according to Richard Helms and Alan Dulles, was to manipulate people's minds. We'll go down the list. It was to show ways of committing murder and getting away with it. How to murder and how to use drugs to erase people's memories, how to get away with it. Another purpose was to bend their minds away from what they would be thinking to various opinions, and so they called it mind bending. They developed a wide variety of bacteria to destroy petroleum products and in fertilizer of foods. Now, keep in mind what's spraying today in 1984, the question. They wanted to make sociological studies of segments of populations. I wanted analysis of voting trends in Switzerland through drugs, LSD, and Santos Lab to affect how you vote. They wanted to be able to predict human behavior given a given situation through chemicals administered. These were tested in over 86 universities, hospitals, prisons, and also the health, education, welfare, even giving syphilis to people and not telling them to see how they react under the circumstances. They used brothels to discredit people and blackmail them and put drugs and medication to people in the brothels. They wanted to find a perfect way to cause brain concussions that would look like accidents. They wanted to find ways for agents to drink a lot and yet stay sober during their various missions if they were alcoholics. They wanted to find substances, this is what they found and worked on, to promote illogical thinking. I read this before, and impulsiveness, to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public. That's what Howard used, was administered from 1957 to 66. And by the time he left the Pink Palace, that Beverly Hills Hotel, nobody cared what happened to him and didn't ask after he went to Boston for the brain surgery. Think of Congressman Mills and Senator Muskie during campaigning, or Martha Mitchell, who was given these drugs and her daughter was brought in to see her and then never saw her again, or Dita Beard. Okay, they wanted you to be discredited in public. This is what has happened to Larry. Ever since those people moved in, everywhere he goes, he got to look sillier. They wanted to find a substance that would make it impossible for a man to perform any physical activity whatsoever. They wanted to find a substance to create euphoria with no subsequent letdown, a permanent high. That is known as the Tavistock smile by John Rawlings Rees of Nazi Germany and Great Britain. Jimmy Carter has that Tavistock smile, and Ronald Reagan has it under any circumstances. He gets on the helicopter, he leaves. It doesn't matter what happens in Grenada and Lebanon. When his best friend Justin Dart died last week, he was down there in New Orleans with Amway. He has that Tavistock smile, that euphoria. Nothing matters. Whether they see their children, don't see the children, go to his hometown on his birthday, he has that constant euphoria, totally inappropriate for a man. The budget is going belly under, the interest is more than the income coming in, and all you get is that euphoria. They want to find ways to incapacitate entire buildings full of people through air conditioning plants. They wanted to manufacture, and they did all these things. This was one of a 25 million hunt. There was even more. Manufacture food that looks and tastes normal, but when it's eaten creates anxiety and fear. I remember when Larry Flynn called, what's new? What's new? There's going to be a neutron bomb in Los Angeles, I told you. Reagan's going to be killed in South Korea. Totally frightened. The world's coming to an end this weekend. I think I've put on the air or told friends, I said, well, for goodness sakes, if you really think that I'm going down to Big Sur for the day, it was on a Sunday, it's a beautiful day, why am I riding for you? If you really believe it, I may as well take the day off. And if you don't believe it, you're being poisoned. And I guess I'm probably the only person around Larry Flynn that ever talked like that, because I have all these documents and I know what they can do to you. They want to find ways to achieve controlled production of earaches, of twitches, of headaches. What do you take? Aspirin, Tylenol? You see the evening programs. What do you want to take? Find ways to control production of these particular symptoms. Find ways to cause jerks or staggering, people to become bewildering. I mentioned that with self-doubting, where you subvert your own principles, where you make a Jew become a Nazi or a black to kill another black, and have you go against your own system and train you like Bernard Weissman at the time of the Kennedy assassination, working with the anti-Semites, or David Berkowitz, getting people against their own systems, or Mark David Chapman, who likes the Beatles, turning him into a Beatle hater to kill John Lennon. They want to produce long amnesia so that their agents would never remember or implicate their superiors. When they leave the agency or the deathbed, they remember nothing. This was one of the chemicals of the 25 Million Project. Find ways to kill with chemicals. Find ways, as I say, to murder without a trace. Study the effect of Adolf Hitler's psychiatrist. This was one of the things they wanted to do, Dr. Edmund Forster's, to study at the Berlin University the psychiatrists that worked with Adolf Hitler. Ernest Weiss wrote a book, The Eyewitness, a Soldier. It's about Hitler under hypnosis and the suggestions of Adolf Hitler, and they wanted to study Adolf Hitler's psychiatrist. Take offensive operational use of LSD against the defined enemy, whether it's a judge or a city councilman or a writer. You study the enemy and then you give them LSD. Find drugs for the proper brain technique to speed up the treatment of psychiatric patients and eliminate all bad feelings and attitude by way of chemicals so that they're not fearful of them. Compare the effect of LSD and alcohol combined, use them together. Identify the pleasure and pain areas of the brain to induce pain. Find the maximum levels of physical and emotional stress in human beings. Discover the biochemical mechanism that causes delirium. Find the way to render an individual helpless or an animal helpless and immobile. This is useful when if there's a watchdog next door or a dog in the house, and Jolly West was good at this. I think he even shot elephants. And recently there was a bear that needed treatment, and you find ways to make them immobile, and then you render them. This is the way you could get that general in Houston, Texas, to be hung up with his hands behind his back. They say that he committed suicide. He didn't commit suicide. Nobody who ever remembers these documents from 1977 that I've heard on a talk show, or I don't listen to many of them, or read, has even suggested that all you do is shoot a substance to him to make him not move, and then you hang him up, and you can pin a note on that said Carlos was here. It doesn't matter what you put. He didn't write it, and you hang that up there. They wanted a way to turn alcoholics into drug addicts. They wanted to find a K drug to kill advanced cancer patients. That's like Jack Ruby, Martha Mitchell, Clay Shaw, Hubert Humphrey. Advanced, how you do the cancer patients in. Drugs to silence your agents as well as amnesia, to cause reversal chemical lobotomies where you surgically don't have to go into the eye. They have a needle that goes into the eye, but to say that, you do it chemically. How to disturb the memory. One of their projects going back to the 50s, the CIA, was how to alternate sex patterns, how to create gays and lesbians and turn the men into women and the women into men. And I recently read an article in the London Times I'll bring in about a chemical the United States government has been giving to children in Puerto Rico, and they're developed. The boys have breasts, and the girls are at puberty by the time they're 5 or 6 years old, and the woman who was there administering the drugs was threatened and almost killed on a road identical to Karen Silkwood when she was going to break the story. There's a picture of the young boys with breasts in the London Times, how to change their sexes. How to, as I say, disturb the memory, alternate the sex pattern, how to elucidate information from others. This is a list of what the CIA spent. We're getting ready for the next program now. Just update them in 1 minute. $25 million for just these projects with chemicals that Alan Dulles of the CIA was working on with Richard Helms and the top people. These were reports that Frank Church got out in 1977 in the congressional hearings, just one set of reports of alternating. And you see how many things are happening. They want to create a natural toxic psychosis that makes people disoriented and into a coma. And as they how to speed along terminal ill cancer and hasten the death of elderly, how to identify a diagnosis of illness from voice patterns, and so forth. I think you get the point that there is a strong case. These particular people that were around Larry from the time he decided to write about Larry McDonald and Western Goals and the Los Angeles Police Department. And the reason I'm concerned for a number of reasons. Number one, I feel partly responsible because I helped with that first article, the one that's not allowed to be sold in Virginia that was taken off the stands. And the second thing, I recognize the symptoms. And I couldn't help him, and I tried to warn him. And third, I watched it progress until this pathetic thing in court that really sent the people that worked for him, Hustler, and the people around him into a very sad state of depression. And the only way out is that formula I get. Answer the people that are there, who was around him, and chart out exactly. And if that could be done, I think he would be okay. But if they don't do that, they'll never be able to solve this problem. He is caught exactly like a fly in a spider web. That's what the Odessa is. And these people worked with Fritz Schwend and the Galen operation, and that's what he got into. Well, now our time is really up now. They've got about 4 seconds. So in that moment, 2 seconds, I'll say it's Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. 2 seconds.
How's it going, Mae?
How are you?
I'm doing fine.